The city of light, the city of silence, Athens is remembered as the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and art. A city where marble temples gleamed under the sun, and poets spoke of virtue, reason, and beauty. Yet beneath that polished surface existed another Athens, one rarely honored in statues or speeches. This was a city of locked doors and silent suffering, where lives were consumed quietly while the world above debated ethics and justice. Ancient writers hinted at it in passing. Archaeologists later uncovered its traces in broken bones and scorched walls. But for centuries, this hidden world was dismissed as an uncomfortable footnote. To understand ancient Greece fully, one must descend into the shadows it tried so hard to conceal. In the crowded districts near the Agora, where merchants shouted prices and philosophers gathered students, entire buildings functioned as legal institutions of exploitation. These places were not secret in the modern sense. They operated openly, regulated by law, taxed by the state, and protected by social custom. What made them invisible was not their location, but the silence surrounding those trapped inside. The women who lived there were not considered citizens, or even people in the legal sense. They were classified as property, their value measured in daily earnings rather than years of life. Court records and surviving speeches from classical Athens describe these women in cold, transactional language, listing prices, categories, and ownership disputes as casually as one might discuss livestock. There was no minimum age recorded in law, and surviving fragments from ancient writers suggest that very young girls were absorbed into this system with no protection and no recourse. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. Ownership was enforced not only by violence, but by law itself, which treated a fleeing woman as a stolen object rather than a human being seeking freedom. Archaeological evidence has begun to confirm what ancient texts only whispered. Excavations near known commercial districts of Athens have uncovered cramped stone rooms with iron fittings, drainage channels filled with human remains, and skeletal injuries consistent with repeated trauma. These were not isolated crimes or rare abuses. They were patterns repeated daily, normalized by custom, and sustained by profit. The city benefited from the trade through taxes, and so the system endured, protected by those who had the most to gain from its continuation. Religion did not stand apart from this world. Festivals dedicated to certain gods temporarily erased even the thin boundaries that existed on ordinary days. During these periods, violence was reframed as ritual, suffering as devotion, and cruelty as celebration. Ancient sources describe these events without outrage, suggesting how deeply such practices were embedded in the cultural fabric. What modern readers find horrifying was, to many contemporaries, simply tradition. This contradiction lies at the heart of ancient Greece's legacy. A civilization that produced timeless ideas about reason and humanity also constructed systems that erased both for those deemed expendable. Philosophers spoke of virtue, while entire classes of women were denied the most basic recognition as human beings. History remembered the speeches, the sculptures, and the victories, but it buried the cost paid by those whose voices were never recorded. What survived did so by accident through fragments, ruins, and bones left behind. And as these remnants surface, they force a darker question into the light. If this was the foundation beneath one of history's most celebrated civilizations, what else have we chosen not to see? The answer waits behind the next-door history, tried to keep closed. Bodies turned into currency. In ancient Greece, desire was not only tolerated, it was organized, regulated, and quietly woven into the machinery of the state. What appears shocking to modern eyes was treated as ordinary commerce, managed with ledgers, taxes, and legal definitions. Entire lives were reduced to daily calculations, measured not by health or survival, but by how much profit could be extracted before the body failed. Owners kept careful accounts, recording earnings and expenses as though they were managing tools rather than human beings. Food, clothing, and shelter were never gifts. They were debts added to an invisible balance that ensured permanent bondage. The system was designed so that freedom was always mathematically impossible. The law itself reinforced this reality. These women had no legal voice, no recognized consent, and no protection against abuse. Their testimony was considered worthless unless verified through torture. A cruel logic that assumed truth could only emerge through pain. Refusing a client was not disobedience, but damage to property, and punishment followed swiftly. Violence was not random. It was systematic, meant to discipline, intimidate, and remind everyone watching of the consequences of resistance. Over time, fear became routine, and survival depended on learning when to be silent, when to endure, and when to disappear emotionally in order to keep the body functioning. Economic demand shaped cruelty into categories. Ancient sources describe how women were sorted, priced, and advertised based on physical traits, origin, or perceived obedience. Certain injuries were not hidden but displayed, treated as marks that appealed to specific buyers. Pain itself became a product, something to be sold and consumed. Walls once covered with graffiti reveal requests for acts that blurred the line between commerce and punishment, showing that violence was not merely tolerated, but actively sought by some. In this world, suffering was not a consequence of the trade. It was one of its selling points. Religious festivals intensified everything. During celebrations such as Dionysia, restraint dissolved under wine, music, and ritual frenzy. Normal rules were suspended, and what remained of dignity vanished entirely. Ancient writers described these events with unsettling calm, framing them as sacred obligations rather than human atrocities. Priests claimed the gods demanded excess, that chaos pleased divine forces, and that blood and suffering ensured prosperity. When religion sanctioned violence, there was no appeal left, no boundary that could not be crossed. What makes this system truly disturbing is not only its brutality, but its efficiency. It worked because it was profitable, socially accepted, and legally protected. Citizens debated ethics in public squares, while ignoring the screams echoing behind closed doors. The city functioned smoothly because those at the bottom were rendered invisible. Their pain fueled the economy, entertained the crowd, and satisfied traditions older than memory. And as long as the system delivered profit and pleasure, few questioned the cost. Yet cracks were already forming beneath the surface. Bodies broke faster than they could be replaced, and whispers of excess began to trouble even ancient observers. Beneath the numbers and rituals lay a truth that could not be fully buried forever, a truth that would eventually rise from the earth itself, written not in words, but in bone and silence. The rituals men called sacred, there were moments in the Athenian calendar when ordinary cruelty was no longer enough. On these days, excess was not only permitted but encouraged, wrapped in the language of devotion and tradition. Religious festivals transformed the city into a place where restraint dissolved and boundaries vanished, and acts that would normally be hidden behind walls spilled openly into public life. The most unsettling aspect was not the violence itself, but the way it was justified. Priests and officials claimed these rites honored the gods, that human suffering, when offered in the correct setting, became sacred rather than shameful. Under this belief, pain was rebranded as purpose. Many of these ceremonies were dedicated to Dionysus, a deity associated with wine, ecstasy, and the loss of self. Ancient writers described his festivals as moments when social order was deliberately overturned. Music thundered through the streets, torches flickered in crowded courtyards, and intoxication blurred judgment until cruelty felt like celebration. In these spaces, women were no longer individuals, but symbols, tools through which men believed they could commune with divine chaos. What happened during these nights was recorded casually by some sources, as though it were no more remarkable than a banquet or a play. The rituals followed a pattern. Large groups gathered, fueled by alcohol and collective excitement, while those at the lowest level of society were handed over without protection. Ancient accounts speak of contests, wagers, and laughter. turning endurance into spectacle and humiliation into entertainment. Music masked screams, and cheers drowned out any trace of protest. What shocked later historians was not only the acts themselves, but the absence of outrage in contemporary descriptions. Suffering was normalized to such a degree that it barely registered as noteworthy. Medical texts from the period hint at the aftermath. Injuries recorded without names, deaths attributed to festival excess, and bodies disposed of beyond city walls as though they were waste rather than human remains. Those who survived were expected to return immediately to their previous roles, carrying new wounds beneath forced smiles. There was no recovery, no pause, and no acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. Ritual demanded continuity, and the system allowed no space for mercy. Religion provided the perfect shield. When violence was framed as sacred duty, questioning it became dangerous. To challenge the ritual was to challenge tradition, the gods, and the authority of those who interpreted divine will. Over time, this protection allowed the worst practices to deepen rather than fade. What began as symbolic transgression evolved into calculated exploitation, reinforced by belief and fear. Faith, power, and profit fused into a single force that crushed those caught beneath it. Yet even in ancient times, traces of discomfort surface between the lines of surviving texts. Some writers avoided detail. Others changed tone, becoming vague where they had once been precise. It is in these silences that modern historians sense unease, the faint recognition that something had gone too far. The rituals continued, but the ground beneath them was already absorbing evidence that words would not preserve. Long after the music ended and the torches burned out, the truth waited patiently below, sealed in earth and memory, ready to confront those who would one day uncover it. Law, ownership, and the erasure of humanity in ancient Greece, the law did not exist to protect everyone equally. It was a structure built carefully around status, gender, and ownership, and for those trapped at the bottom, it functioned less as justice and more as a weapon. A woman bound to a brothel was not recognized as a person with rights or intent. In legal terms, she was an object, and every movement of her body belonged to someone else. When she suffered violence, it was not treated as harm. When she resisted, it was treated as damage. And when she tried to flee, the law named it theft, not escape. Punishment for disobedience was designed to be public and unforgettable. Ancient legal records describe penalties meant not only to hurt the individual, but to warn all who witnessed them. Branding with hot iron was common, leaving marks that announced ownership and failure for the rest of a woman's life. These scars were not hidden. They were displayed deliberately, turning the body itself into a legal document. Other punishments were even more extreme, involving prolonged exposure, physical restraint, or slow deaths meant to demonstrate the cost of defiance. Justice in this system was theater. Seeking protection offered little hope. Temples, which modern readers might imagine as places of refuge, were often complicit in returning escapees to their owners. Priests weighed profit and influence against mercy, and too often chose the former. A woman dragging herself to an altar was not seen as a victim pleading for sanctuary, but as a disputed possession interrupting order. Bribes smoothed the process, and chains restored the balance. Faith bent easily under the pressure of money and custom, revealing how deeply exploitation had seeped into every institution. Even testimony was denied to them. A woman's word held no value in court unless extracted through torture, based on the belief that pain alone could force truth from an inferior being. This cruel logic ensured silence. Speaking out meant suffering first, and even then, there was no guarantee of justice. As a result, most abuses went unrecorded, absorbed into daily routine, leaving behind only indirect traces in legal language that spoke of fines, compensation, and property disputes instead of shattered lives. The contradiction was stark. The same society that praised rational law and civic order accepted a system that relied on fear, humiliation, and absolute control. Democracy existed, but only for a narrow portion of the population. Below it stretched a vast, unacknowledged foundation of people excluded entirely from the concept of citizenship. Their labor sustained the city, their suffering entertained it, and their silence protected its image. Over time, the cost of this system became impossible to hide completely. Bodies weakened faster than laws could justify, and deaths accumulated beyond what ritual and punishment could explain away. Owners replaced women cheaply rather than treat them, viewing care as wasted expense. This constant cycle of use and disposal left a growing physical record beneath the streets, one that no court could silence. While lawmakers argued above ground, the earth below began collecting evidence, patiently preserving the truth for those who would one day dig deep enough to face it. Bones beneath the ruins. For centuries, the official story of ancient Greece survived almost untouched, polished by admiration and repetition. Philosophers were quoted, victories celebrated, and ruins admired for their beauty rather than their silence. But the ground beneath those ruins never forgot. Long after voices were erased and records softened by time, the soil continued to hold what history tried to discard. When modern archaeologists began excavating areas once known for commercial and ritual activity, they did not find myths or metaphors. They found bodies, and those bodies told a story that words had deliberately avoided. Skeletons uncovered near ancient urban districts showed patterns that could not be dismissed as accidents or isolated violence. Pelvic bones bore signs of repeated trauma, fractures healed incorrectly, and spinal damage consistent with years of physical strain. Skulls showed cracks from blunt force, ribs had been broken and rebroken, and teeth were shattered in ways that suggested intentional blows rather than disease. These were not the remains of soldiers or laborers injured by chance. They were the remains of people whose bodies had been used until they failed, then discarded without ceremony or care. Even more disturbing were the remains found in drainage channels and refuse pits. Infant bones appeared alongside household waste, too small to belong to accidents of nature. The placement suggested disposal rather than burial, routine rather than tragedy. In societies where formal burial rites were considered essential for the dead, this absence spoke volumes. These lives were not mourned because they were never fully acknowledged. Pregnancy, when it occurred, was treated as damage to property, not creation of life, and the archaeological record confirms how often that damage was erased. Medical writings from antiquity, once read as neutral observations, take on a darker meaning when paired with physical evidence. Notes describing infections, internal injuries, and early deaths appear detached, almost clinical, as though describing livestock rather than patients. Treatment was rare, not because knowledge was absent, but because care cost more than replacement. The remains confirm this cold calculation. Many skeletons show untreated injuries that would have been survivable with rest and basic care, suggesting neglect rather than inevitability. What makes these discoveries especially powerful is the resistance to reinterpretation. Philosophical texts can be reframed, legal records softened, and rituals explained away as products of their time. Bones cannot. They record force, repetition, and endurance without language or bias. Each fracture is a sentence. Each malformed joint is a paragraph. Together, they form a testimony no ancient author intended to preserve. As more sites were examined, a pattern emerged that matched the darkest descriptions found in fragmentary texts. The archaeological record did not exaggerate the cruelty. If anything, it suggested that much had gone unrecorded. What was written represented only what society was willing to admit. What lay underground revealed what it tried to forget. The celebrated civilization of reason and beauty rested on foundations built with bodies that were never meant to be remembered. And yet, even as this evidence surfaced, it raised an unsettling question. If these truths could remain buried for so long beneath one of history's most studied cultures, what else lies hidden beneath civilizations we still admire today? The ruins have spoken, but their message forces a final reckoning that reaches far beyond the past. What civilization chose to forget? When all the fragments are placed together, the picture that emerges is not one of isolated cruelty, but of a system carefully designed to endure. Ancient Greece did not simply fail to protect its most vulnerable. It constructed laws, customs, and beliefs that ensured their suffering remained profitable and invisible. The city celebrated order, reason, and harmony, yet depended on a hidden population whose lives were defined by disorder, fear, and pain. This contradiction was not accidental. It was the price paid for comfort, entertainment, and the illusion of moral superiority. History itself became an accomplice. Writers focused on philosophers, generals, and public achievements, while those without legal standing vanished from the narrative. Their experiences survived only in fragments, distorted by language that reduced them to objects or numbers. Over time, admiration replaced scrutiny. Textbooks praised democracy without asking who was excluded from it, and art celebrated the human form while ignoring the bodies that were broken to sustain daily life. Silence became tradition, passed down as faithfully as any myth. What makes this silence so powerful is how familiar it feels. The mechanisms that erase these women from history are not unique to antiquity. Labeling people as property, redefining violence as necessity, and framing exploitation as culture are patterns repeated across time. Ancient Greece provides one of the earliest, clearest examples, but not the last. The ruins remind us that civilization is not defined only by what it creates, but by what it is willing to sacrifice without acknowledgement. Modern discoveries have forced historians to confront uncomfortable truths, yet even now there is resistance. Some prefer to separate philosophical achievement from social reality, as if ideas can exist independently of the systems that sustain them. But the evidence does not allow such division. The same society that debated ethics in public relied on private suffering to function smoothly. The contradiction is inseparable, and recognizing it does not diminish history, it deepens it. The women whose bones lie beneath the ruins were never meant to be remembered. Their names were not carved into stone, their stories not written in scrolls. Yet they endured longer than the men who owned them, preserved by the very earth that witnessed their lives. In this way, they achieved a form of permanence denied to them in life. Their remains challenge the polished image of the past and demand that admiration be tempered with accountability. In the end, this history does not ask for condemnation alone, but for awareness. Civilization has always been selective in what it remembers and what it hides. The danger lies not in acknowledging darkness, but in repeating the habit of looking away. Ancient Greece taught the world how to reason, debate, and imagine justice. It also taught, through silence and suffering, how easily those ideals can be betrayed. What we choose to remember from its legacy says as much about us as it does about them.